Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everything you believed about reality was nothing more than shadows dancing on a cave wall. That the life you thought you were living was actually a carefully constructed illusion, and that you, along with nearly everyone else, had been living as a prisoner without even realizing it. This isn't the plot of some dystopian science fiction movie. This is exactly what Socrates, one of history's greatest philosophers, believed about the human condition over 2,400 years ago. In fact, Socrates was so convinced that most people live in a state of unknowing imprisonment that he dedicated his entire life to waking them up from this slumber. He compared the average person to a prisoner chained in a cave, mistaking shadows for reality, living a life of profound ignorance while believing themselves to be wise. And here's the most unsettling part. He believed that when someone tries to free these prisoners and show them the truth, they often become violent and hostile toward their would-be liberator. But what did Socrates mean by this? How can we be prisoners without knowing it? And more importantly, if this ancient philosopher was right, how do we break free from these invisible chains that bind us? The answers to these questions might completely transform how you see your own life and the world around you. Socrates lived in Athens during what many consider the golden age of Greek civilization, yet he spent his days challenging everything that people took for granted. He wandered the streets, engaging politicians, artists, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens in conversations that left them questioning their most basic assumptions about life, morality, knowledge, and truth. He didn't do this to be difficult or argumentative. He did it because he genuinely believed that most people were living in a kind of mental prison, trapped by their own ignorance and false beliefs. The foundation of Socrates' philosophy rests on a paradox that initially seems almost insulting: the idea that wisdom begins with recognizing our own ignorance. As he famously declared, "I know that I know nothing." This wasn't false modesty or intellectual humility for the sake of appearances. It was a profound recognition that most of what we think we know is actually a collection of unexamined assumptions, inherited beliefs, and convenient illusions that we've never bothered to question seriously. Think about your own life for a moment. How many of your beliefs about success, happiness, morality, relationships, or even basic facts about the world have you actually examined critically? How many of these beliefs did you simply absorb from your family, your culture, your education, or your social media feed? Socrates would argue that if you're like most people, the vast majority of what you believe to be true is actually a kind of mental furniture that someone else arranged for you. And you've been living in this pre-furnished mental space without ever questioning whether the arrangement actually serves you. This brings us to what Socrates considered the first and most crucial step toward freedom: self-examination. He believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and he meant this quite literally. In his view, a person who goes through life without seriously questioning their beliefs, assumptions, and values is not truly living at all, simply going through the motions, following scripts written by others, reacting to shadows on the cave wall, rather than engaging with reality itself. But why did Socrates think this kind of unexamined living was so dangerous? The answer lies in his understanding of how ignorance operates in human life. Ignorance, in the Socratic sense, isn't simply a lack of information. It's something much more insidious. It's the confident belief in things that aren't true, combined with a complete lack of awareness that these beliefs might be false. Consider how this plays out in modern life. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, yet we're also living through what many experts call an epidemic of misinformation and polarization. People hold passionate opinions about complex topics they've never seriously studied. They make major life decisions based on assumptions they've never questioned. They judge others harshly while remaining blind to their own contradictions and biases. This is exactly the kind of imprisonment that Socrates was talking about. The prison isn't made of metal bars or concrete walls. It's constructed from our own unexamined beliefs, our emotional reactions, our need to be right, our fear of uncertainty, and our tendency to mistake our limited perspective for absolute truth. We become prisoners of our own minds, trapped by ideas and assumptions that we've never bothered to investigate seriously. Socrates understood that this kind of mental imprisonment doesn't just affect individuals, it shapes entire societies. When most people in a community are living unexamined lives, following unquestioned assumptions, and reacting from a place of unconscious ignorance, the result is a culture that mistakes shadows for reality. Important decisions get made based on false premises. Leaders rise to power by appealing to people's unexamined beliefs, rather than their capacity for wisdom. Injustice flourishes because people lack the clarity to recognize it, or the courage to challenge it. This is why Socrates saw his mission as fundamentally political, even though he never held political office. He believed that the health of society depended on individuals developing the capacity for clear thinking, self-awareness, and genuine wisdom. A community of examined lives would naturally create better institutions, more just laws, and wiser leadership. But a community of unexamined lives would inevitably fall prey to demagogues' false promises and collective delusions. The process of examination that Socrates advocated wasn't comfortable or easy. In fact, he compared it to the work of a midwife, helping people give birth to ideas and insights they didn't even know they were carrying. But this philosophical midwifery often involved considerable pain, as it required people to confront the possibility that their most cherished beliefs might be false, their most confident opinions might be groundless, and their entire way of understanding the world might need to be rebuilt from the ground up. Socrates developed a method for this kind of deep questioning that we now call the Socratic method. Rather than simply telling people what to think, he would ask them a series of carefully crafted questions, designed to expose the contradictions and assumptions in their thinking. He would start with something the person claimed to know well, then gradually reveal through questioning that their knowledge was far less solid than they had believed. For example, if someone claimed to know what justice was, Socrates might ask them to define it. When they gave their definition, he would present them with examples that didn't fit their definition, forcing them to refine or revise their understanding. This process would continue until the person realized that they didn't actually have a clear, consistent understanding of justice at all. The goal wasn't to humiliate or defeat them, but to help them recognize the difference between genuine knowledge and the illusion of knowledge. This distinction between real knowledge and the illusion of knowledge is crucial to understanding why Socrates thought most people live as prisoners. When we think we know something that we don't actually know, we stop questioning, stop learning, and stop growing. We become trapped in a fixed mental framework that prevents us from seeing clearly or responding wisely to new situations. True knowledge, in the Socratic sense, is always provisional and open to revision. It's grounded in careful observation, rigorous questioning, and honest self-reflection. It acknowledges its own limitations and remains curious about what it doesn't yet understand. This kind of knowledge creates freedom because it allows us to respond to life with flexibility, wisdom, and genuine understanding, rather than rigid reactions based on unexamined assumptions. But here's where Socrates' insights become even more challenging and relevant to our modern situation. He didn't just believe that most people live as unknowing prisoners. He also believed that they actively resist attempts to free them from their mental prisons. When someone tries to point out the contradictions in their thinking or challenge their unexamined assumptions, they often respond with anger, hostility, or dismissal rather than curiosity or gratitude. This resistance to examination and growth is what ultimately led to Socrates' death. The citizens of Athens became so uncomfortable with his persistent questioning of their beliefs and institutions that they put him on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety. Rather than backing down or apologizing, Socrates used his trial as an opportunity to explain why his mission of examination was essential for the health of both individuals and society. In his defense, recorded by his student Plato in the Apology, Socrates compared himself to a gadfly that bites a lazy horse to keep it moving. He argued that Athens, like most societies, had become intellectually lazy and complacent, and needed someone to sting it into greater awareness and activity. He saw himself as a gift from the gods, sent to wake people up from their mental slumber and challenge them to live more examined, authentic lives. Even when faced with death, Socrates remained committed to his mission of examination and questioning. He famously declared that he feared not death itself, but the possibility of living an unexamined life. He chose execution rather than exile or silence, because he believed that a life without the freedom to question and examine was not worth living. This brings us to a crucial question. If Socrates was right about the human tendency to live as unknowing prisoners, and if people really do resist attempts to free them from their mental prisons, how can we apply his insights to our own lives and relationships? How can we begin the process of examination without simply alienating everyone around us, or falling into our own forms of intellectual arrogance? The answer, according to Socrates, must begin with ourselves. Before we can help others examine their lives, we must be willing to examine our own. This means developing the intellectual humility to acknowledge when we don't know something, the courage to question our own cherished beliefs, and the patience to sit with uncertainty while we work toward greater understanding. Self-examination, in the Socratic sense, isn't a one-time event or a simple process of introspection. It's a lifelong practice of questioning our motivations, examining our assumptions, and testing our beliefs against experience and reason. It requires us to pay attention to our emotional reactions, especially when we feel defensive or certain about something. These reactions often indicate areas where we might be clinging to unexamined beliefs or protecting ourselves from uncomfortable truths. One of the most practical ways to begin this process is to start noticing when you have strong opinions about topics you haven't actually studied in depth. This isn't to say that all opinions are equally valid or that we should never take stands on important issues. Rather, it's about developing the intellectual honesty to distinguish between genuine knowledge based on careful study and reflection, and opinions based on assumption, emotion, or social pressure. Another crucial aspect of Socratic self-examination involves questioning the sources of our beliefs and values. Where did your ideas about success come from? What assumptions about relationships are you carrying from your family of origin or your cultural background? Which of your political opinions are based on actual examination of evidence, and which are simply tribal affiliations or emotional reactions? This process of questioning doesn't necessarily mean rejecting all inherited beliefs or cultural values. Some of them may prove to be wise and well-founded when examined carefully, but the act of examination itself transforms these beliefs from unconscious assumptions into conscious choices. Instead of being prisoners of unexamined ideas, we become free agents capable of choosing what to believe and how to live based on our own investigation and understanding. Socrates also emphasized the importance of dialogue in the process of examination. We can't examine our own thinking in complete isolation because we all have blind spots and limitations in our perspective. Genuine dialogue with others who think differently can help us see these blind spots and challenge us to refine our understanding. But not all conversation qualifies as dialogue in the Socratic sense. Much of what passes for discussion in our current culture is actually debate, where the goal is to win rather than to learn, or mere exchange of opinions without any real examination of underlying assumptions. Socratic dialogue requires a genuine commitment to truth-seeking rather than winning, a willingness to be changed by the conversation, and the intellectual humility to admit when we don't know something or when our thinking has been unclear. Creating this kind of dialogue requires skill and practice. It means learning to ask good questions rather than simply asserting our own views. It means listening carefully to understand rather than listening to find ammunition for our next argument. It means being willing to acknowledge when someone else makes a good point, even if it challenges our existing beliefs. Perhaps most importantly, Socratic dialogue requires us to distinguish between the person and their ideas. We can challenge someone's thinking vigorously while still respecting them as a human being. We can disagree strongly with someone's conclusions while still acknowledging their good intentions and their right to their own perspective. This distinction becomes crucial when we consider how to apply Socratic insights in our relationships with family, friends, and colleagues who may be living what Socrates would call unexamined lives. The temptation is often either to become preachy and superior, trying to force others to see the world as we do, or to become cynical and dismissive, writing off everyone who hasn't engaged in the same process of examination that we have. Neither approach honors the spirit of Socratic inquiry. Socrates didn't see himself as superior to the people he questioned. He saw himself as someone who had simply recognized his own ignorance more clearly than they had recognized theirs. This recognition didn't make him better than them. It simply made him more aware of how much he still needed to learn. Approach others from this place of intellectual humility. We can engage in genuine inquiry together, rather than trying to convert them to our way of thinking. We can ask questions that invite them to examine their own assumptions without attacking or threatening their identity. We can model the kind of openness and curiosity that makes examination feel safe rather than dangerous. This approach is particularly important in our current cultural moment, when many people feel that their most basic beliefs and values are under attack. When people feel threatened, they naturally become defensive and close-minded. But when they feel respected and understood, they are much more likely to engage in the kind of honest self-reflection that Socrates advocated. The goal isn't to create a world where everyone thinks exactly alike, but rather to create a world where more people are thinking clearly and honestly about what they believe and why they believe it. A community of examined lives would naturally include a diversity of perspectives and conclusions, but these differences would be grounded in genuine reflection rather than unconscious assumption or tribal loyalty. This brings us to what might be the most challenging aspect of Socratic wisdom, learning to live comfortably with uncertainty and incomplete knowledge. Our culture tends to reward confident assertions and decisive action. But Socratic examination often leads to greater awareness of how much we don't know and how complex most important questions really are. This uncertainty isn't a weakness or failure. It's actually a sign of intellectual maturity and wisdom. As Socrates put it, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. This doesn't mean that we can't make decisions or take action when we don't have complete information. It means that we hold our conclusions lightly, remain open to new evidence and perspectives, and resist the temptation to mistake our limited understanding for absolute truth. Living with this kind of intellectual humility requires considerable courage and emotional maturity. It's much more comfortable to believe that we have everything figured out than to acknowledge the vast extent of our ignorance. It's easier to dismiss people who disagree with us as stupid or evil than to seriously consider the possibility that they might see something that we're missing. But Socrates believed that this discomfort is the price of freedom. The prisoners in the cave are comfortable in their familiar darkness, even though they're seeing only shadows of reality. Stepping into the light is initially painful and disorienting, but it's the only way to see things as they really are. Metaphor of the cave, developed by Plato to illustrate Socratic ideas, provides a powerful framework for understanding how mental imprisonment works and how liberation might be possible. In this allegory, prisoners are chained in a cave, facing a wall where shadows are projected by a fire behind them. They mistake these shadows for reality itself because they've never seen anything else. When one prisoner is freed and discovers the fire, the objects casting shadows, and eventually the sunlit world outside the cave, he initially experiences pain and confusion. His eyes hurt in the bright light. His familiar world has been revealed as an illusion. Everything he thought he knew has to be reconsidered. The natural response would be to return to the comfortable darkness of the cave. But once someone has seen reality, they can't unsee it. They're faced with a choice: remain in the world of truth and light, despite its challenges, or return to the familiar illusions of the cave. Most choose truth. But when they try to share their discovery with the other prisoners, they meet resistance, mockery, and even hostility. The other prisoners prefer their familiar shadows to the painful process of liberation. They may even attack anyone who tries to free them from their chains. This allegory captures something essential about the human condition that remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. We all begin life in various kinds of caves, chained by the limitations of our perspective, our culture, our family history, and our own psychological patterns. We mistake our limited view of reality for reality itself. The process of education, growth, and wisdom involves gradually breaking free from these chains and expanding our understanding of what's actually real and true. But this process is often painful and disorienting. It requires us to give up comfortable certainties and familiar ways of understanding ourselves and our world. Moreover, when we try to share our expanded understanding with others who are still in their own caves, we often encounter the same kind of resistance that Socrates experienced. People don't thank us for challenging their worldview. They often become defensive, angry, or dismissive. Understanding this dynamic can help us approach the work of examination and dialogue with greater patience and skill. We can recognize that resistance to new ideas isn't necessarily a sign of stupidity or malice. It's often a natural protective response to having one's fundamental assumptions challenged. This understanding can also help us recognize when we ourselves are acting like cave prisoners, resisting information or perspectives that challenge our own comfortable certainties. The process of liberation isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing journey of expanding our understanding and questioning our assumptions throughout our lives. So how do we actually begin this journey of examination and liberation in our own lives? Socrates suggested starting with the questions that matter most to us. What do you most want to understand about life, relationships, success, meaning, or morality? Rather than accepting easy answers or conventional wisdom, what if you approached these questions with genuine curiosity and rigor? The Socratic method provides a practical framework for this investigation. Start by trying to define clearly what you mean by the concepts that matter most to you. What exactly do you mean by happiness, success, love, justice, or fulfillment? Once you have a working definition, test it against your actual experience and observation. Does your definition hold up when you apply it to specific situations? What contradictions or complications emerge? This process of definition and testing can reveal how much of what we think we know is actually vague, contradictory, or borrowed from others without serious examination. But rather than being discouraged by this discovery, we can see it as the beginning of genuine understanding. As we develop greater clarity about our own thinking, we naturally become more effective in our relationships and our work. We make decisions based on examined values rather than unconscious assumptions. We respond to challenges with wisdom rather than reactive emotion. We engage with others from a place of genuine curiosity rather than defensive certainty. Perhaps most importantly, we begin to experience the freedom that comes from living an examined life. Instead of being unconscious prisoners of our own minds, we become conscious participants in our own growth and development. We may not have all the answers, but we're asking better questions and approaching life with greater awareness and intentionality. That this is the legacy that Socrates left us, not a set of doctrines to believe or rules to follow, but a method for breaking free from the mental prisons that limit our understanding and our potential. His example shows us that a life dedicated to examination, questioning, and the pursuit of wisdom is not only possible, but essential for anyone who wants to live fully and freely. The choice is ours. We can remain comfortable prisoners in our familiar caves, mistaking shadows for reality. Or we can undertake the challenging but liberating journey toward greater understanding and wisdom. As Socrates demonstrated through his life and death, this choice isn't just personal, it's also political and moral, affecting not just our own lives but the health and wisdom of our communities and our world. The question that remains is whether we have the courage to follow Socrates' example, to embrace the discomfort of not knowing, and to commit ourselves to the lifelong work of examination that leads to genuine freedom. The shadows on the cave wall are seductive in their familiarity, but the world of truth and wisdom awaits those brave enough to break their chains and step into the light.